This is the A111 tutorial summary on Van Gogh. The thing to start with when looking at this material or any of the arts material is that we can look at it, we can read it, study it, investigate it in a similar way to other subjects. So just for example, in literature, you may look at imagery within text, look at it from a larger socio-historic context. You may look at language choice, grammar, sentence structure. So essentially, you might be looking at the technique of how the words are put together. You may look at the story, and you may look at the larger social world that the text was created in. We're going to do the same thing with art. Look at the technique, the brushstrokes, the colors. You'll look at the artist's history. You'll look at various concepts of the larger art world around it. You'll look at it in history. So while there may be a feeling that art is subjective, it's no more or less subjective than, say, music or literature. You might have the art or the music or the literature that you prefer, but you still should be able to look at it all analytically using some really basic toolkits that we'll be going over in this lesson. So down the side of the slide here, I've got different ways to think about looking at the work. So let's look at this first one. We have the color. Of course, there's a blue. It's a series of blue mixed in with that yellow. It's very it's basing it around one hue. We want to look at the brushwork, chunky strokes, swirled patterns, representations of houses through triangles and squares, just to really that vague image. We know what things are not through extreme detail, but through a larger interpretation, as well as the fineness of the chunky, thick brushstrokes. Look at the design. How is that tree? He set the moon at a diagonal from the tree. He's created a swirl through the middle. And then the landscape rises up. Now remember, he was depicting a real space. So we also then have to think, how did he move his easel, his painting, to catch the design and the angle of the painting? Or did he restructure that design, restructure the angles where the tree is, where the moon is, in order to create the lines that we see? And then of course we have the personal associations, which we talked about are talked about in the OU material, and the subject matter as well. So these are similar to what we talked about in Dickens, is looking at this from a personal context on putting the author, or excuse me, the artist into the painting, or a larger social context. Now, something that was discussed in the materials is the color wheel. And what we have here is how they all fall on the chart. And what you might find, and what is discussed, is some works will stick within certain hues, right? Will stick within these hues here. Earlier, before the Impressionists, the color wasn't as important as the representation. Colors represented, purple represented royalty, the blue of Virgin Mary's veil represented that godliness, but it wasn't about creating the color hues of life. And instead they stuck with certain palettes in certain areas. Whereas Van Gogh, he played with it. He played with these cross colors. Let's go back and look. So here, if you look at the color wheel, we've got so many blues. It's in the blue area, but with a speckling of yellow, which comes from across the color palette. So he's working in this here, a bit of a jump into the yellow, just for highlight. Another way to really understand how Van Gogh was important and how he created this reputation, even if it was after his death, is to look at works of similar themes throughout history and see how things like brushstroke, color, design, set changed. So one thing that he did is he covered the real people, in air quotes, real people. Not necessarily royal figures or scenes of myth or Greek or Bible or Greek myth. He dealt with everyday people. Now, other painters did that before him, but it wasn't as common until we got into the Impressionist era, and then Van Gogh. Um, but let's look at some of these early painters who did have a look at the average person, and let's look and see how they represented it through color and brushstroke. Okay, what we have here is a painting called The Peasant Wedding by Pieter Bruegel the Elder. Now, my ability to say names is not good. You'll notice that by my inability to pronounce Van Gogh. But let's look at this image. So it's a more realistic depiction. Um, so let's look at this image. It's a more realistic depiction. We've got the very standard lines here. We have it going into a foreshadowing. This table's taken us into the foreshadowing. The people, while a bit cartoonish, but they are representations of humans, of individuals. We have a scene going on. These individuals are in a big pub scene. It's a wedding, and they are representations of everyday people. This little guy's pouring some water. Little child's hopefully not picking his nose. He's just eating something. Got someone pulling a pie off a table or a plate of food. And what we have here is a representation, but a representation of a moment in time that that the artist created to show us that world. And remember, see, it might be a representation because it's not a photo. It's not an impression. Let's also look at the color wheel. It's right through here, right through these colors. There's little pops of green here and there. But it gives us a general tone, really. Now let's look at the next section. We're going to move a little bit through time, and we're going to go into a Dutch master. So this is peasants dancing at a tavern. We can see sort of a similar theme to this. They're getting a bit more ruckusy in this one. And the way the design is set up, we have some similarities. Look at this. We've got this focal point of the table going into the horizon. And then here we have a similar thing. We have this sort of narrow road, this focal point going out the door there. So we create like this triangle through here. I'll grab my pen. I'm going to show you on both of them. We have this sort of triangle going through like this, right? And we can see it here as well. See? Going from here through to the door right here. But the light in this seems to be coming from everywhere. Whereas we have what's a representation of the Dutch masters, where they were really known for looking at the light versus the dark. So we have these dark areas in here that are almost black. We can barely see what's happening in these areas. And then within the focal, we have the light that's shining on the people. The light source, you notice, isn't even coming from the door. There's some sort of imaginary light source sort of maybe coming in through here a little bit. Or maybe we are standing in a bit of a light source. It is still a realistic depiction, somewhat a bit cartoonish. We can see this little chappie looks really quite similar to this little chappie in color. We'll come back to color in a second, but it's a realistic depiction. I said the Dutch masters played a lot with light, but we can see the brushstrokes are fine. They're not chunky. It's not supposed to draw attention to the brushstrokes. They're supposed to be looking at the scene. And once again, we have this sort of thing. Now, what we're going to go next is we're going to look at Van Gogh's potato eaters. Now, we don't have that focal point. Everything's in sort of a square, right? And the colors are really muted. So what he does in this one, rather than using those vibrant blues, he's sticking within these browns and greens and yellows, and really just keeping the tone low. He's not glorifying them. They're not having a grand old merry time. They're simply sitting and eating. See a little bit of steam coming up in the light, but also look at them. They're realistic. They're grotesquely painted. They're done to once again do this quick representation of what's going on. It isn't spent hours of fine detail so that we can see that this is a representation of almost like a photo. What this is it's Van Gogh's, how he wanted this scene to be portrayed. Darkness, the light source is from here. In fact, this is our sort of design, like this, is through this here, with one even having her back. She's in complete darkness, or almost complete darkness. But we can still see the room. It's bare. Nothing's hitting too much in the shadows. What we're seeing is just this little slice of life through these chunky, big brushstrokes. And so what you have to remember is this was new. This was a really new way of painting. Now, we'll look at Van Gogh compared to the Impressionists in a moment, but this was something that wasn't seen. And so it was why people weren't getting into him. They're thinking, well, it's not even a representation of a real thing, and it's not as pretty as maybe the Impressionists, and the people are grotesque, and what's going on here is they're not even happy dancing peasants. They're just sitting there eating potatoes with steam coming off of it. It was something they couldn't quite understand. Now let's go forward. Now remember, photography was a very new concept at this time period, but let's look and see what happens when we get into the photography world. This is a depiction from the 1930s. It's in the Library of Congress. It was taken during the Depression era. And we can see we're still using some of the same old tropes. We've got the line of sight, right, going through there. Some people's faces hidden, others more in circle. But what my point of bringing up a photo is that we today are so used to seeing the real capturing of an image that when we look at a photo and a real capturing of an image of everyday people, of what's going on in the world, we forget that this is our norm for us. Even though this is black and white, we're now used to color photos. What we have here was not the norm for them. They used those paintings to depict, whether real or imagined, scenes that could almost be taken from life. And Van Gogh wasn't doing that. And when we get into photography, we can see a lot of the same notions, the same design, the same information being given. Yet, what we don't have is the painting. We don't have the brushstrokes. So I keep saying this is a new thing, but that's also downplaying what the Impressionists were doing. So I think it's important for us to look at the Impressionists. So here we have Monet's bouquet of flowers next to Van Gogh's sunflowers. And what we want to think about is, upon viewing it, we can see that Monet still has a realistic depiction. It almost looks like it's through a gauze, or with our eyes squinted, or get a bit of soap in your eyes. It's a shadowy sort of representation, but still we can clearly see it is. It's you can even see here is a little bit of light on the glass, right? You have the shadowing right here. The leaves still have a shadowing to them. These in the back aren't catching as much light as these. We can see these little individual petals. So what the Impressionists were doing, they wanted to catch a moment, an impression of the moment in time. And they were very fixated on light. And so painters like Monet, they would set their easel up in the same place every day and get a quick moment of painting of that same place day after day with the different lights. And they would paint so fast just to get an impression of that light. And they started to play with that and look at that. Well, Van Gogh's doing the same thing, but he's moving it to even more the abstract. And let's look at these flowers. I mean, we can see some of them are a bit wilted here, but there's no shadowing. We have no shadowing here. There's none. Maybe a little bit right here, very similar to Monet's. But really, this is a complete, not just even an impression, it's an interpretation of what the flowers look like. Even these flowers are somewhat grotesque. The way they fold upon themselves, the way they pop open, and some we can see full leaves, others are just lost up in a series of, if we could scan cosin on this, into chunky stippling, chunky work. So this is what you want to think about. We've got our little color wheel up here. Monet is playing with blues and greens. He's kind of working through here with a lovely little red underneath to give it a pop. Whereas, Van Gogh's really just in the yellow and the green. So he's playing with these colors. So that's one way to read. So just like when we talked about Dickens, and we read Dickens for imagery, the comedy and juxtaposition to the darkness, looking at the point of view in Dickens, so we could see that unnamed narrator in. So we were looking for first person pronouns. We're doing a similar sort of reading with art. We're looking at brushstroke, we're looking at design, we're looking at how it's set up. And then we're also looking at that historic context. What does it come from before? Where is it going from? And then, as you'll know, you'll have the story of Van Gogh in the OU materials to think about how he was treated and how he came to be the artist and how his brother supported him and helped him get his name out there, but it didn't really work. And the mental health issues around that. And we want to think about the Impressionists, which he was coming off of. We're doing similar things, but not to the same extent. They were still allowing some of that realism in it. So when you're reading art, these are the different things you want to take into context. And then you think, how do those things make the viewer, the person look at the paint, feel? How does it set in time? What does it make the artist feel? And why is it important in that larger context? The last thing we're going to think about is socio-political. And let's go back to our potato eaters for that. So just like in Dickens, we learned a little bit about history through the work. We can learn a little bit about history through the paintings as well. So that's it for Van Gogh. Have a look, match this up with the OU materials, and think about how you're reading for various different ways to interpret a painting, or even, as we discussed with Dickens, a text.